Just before the end of 2020, I upgraded my 2014 PC with new GPU, CPU, motherboard and RAM. Now the time has come to also upgrade the case, the AIO Watercooler and the PSU power supply. I decided to turn this project into a YouTube video series called It's Not That Hard to Build a PC, where I will cover both PC disassembly and assembly. The video series will be presented in 3 segments. In this video, I will disassemble the AMD PC shown above upper left. Green parts were recently upgraded, while the red parts will be replaced. In the second video, I'm going to rebuild the AMD system in a new case with new AIO and PSU to be used as my main gaming and casual video editing PC as shown above right. In a third video, I will assemble my old 2014 Intel PC from the leftovers to be repurposed as a home office machine. A new air cooler and NVMe card will also be added to complete the home office PC. I really think that the best way to learn how to put a PC together is to take one apart. Hopefully by the end of this video, you too will see that taking a PC apart is not that difficult. Disclaimer: I've been building and upgrading PCs for myself and the family for the past 25 years as an enthusiast. There was no YouTube or any nice instructional videos when I started, which means that I have few bad habits that will surely cause me some pain, such as not having a build plan before I build anything or not always reading the functional manual. So don't be like me, be better than me. When I do make mistakes, I will point them out in the video instead of cutting them out so you can learn. I'm not a professional system builder, so you should always refer to the instructions provided by your component manufacturer to ensure you don't wreck your stuff. My goal is to give you an idea of what type of challenges, mistakes, and tasks you might run into when building a system. That's enough lollygagging. Let's get started. First, I begin by placing the case on its right side. I avoid surfaces such as rocks that might cause static electricity. Unlike me, you should wear ESD, electrostatic discharge band, to ensure to adhere to best practices for handling electronics. I start to undo the left side panel screws. Then, with the left panel removed, I now have access to the internals. I will take a moment to familiarize myself with the location of components such as the GPU, RAM, and CPU. Note, if you see me placing the case in a different orientation than what is ideal, is only because I'm filming. The placement of my camera limits my movement. I want to start removing the video card, but first, I need to make sure that no cables or other components are in the way. Everything looks good, so I start disconnecting the PCIe power connectors from the video card. This RTX 380 uses two 6+2 pins or 8-pin power connectors. I never pull the wires directly. I release the clip mechanism on the cable, which is on the connector, by squeezing the clip while pulling out the connector. Gently wiggling the connector left to right while pulling can help too. Just take your time. Never ever boot force while unplugging or installing anything in a PC to avoid damaging components. Gentle and slow is the way to go. Once the power cables are removed, I tuck them out of the way. Also notice here that I'm wearing a watch, but I should really have removed it to reduce chances of my watch getting caught in wires or components. The next step is to unscrew the GPU from the case. I will now locate the screws connecting the GPU to the case and begin to loosen them. Most modern cases use thumb screws, so once initially loosened, I can just use my fingers to do the rest. Keep in mind that large GPUs such as this one use at least 2 expansion base slots, so I will need to remove 2 screws. The next step is to release the GPU from the PCIe lock. Refer to your motherboard manual for instructions. In my case, I need to slide the lock towards the front of the case to release the card. Never pull the card out without releasing the PCIe lock first. It's best to do this while the case is on its side, since the weight of the GPU might cause it to fall out after being unlocked from a horizontal position. I now pull the GPU out of the PCIe slot while securely holding it with both hands. I find that wiggling the GPU slightly helps. If the GPU is not coming out, I do not force it out. I make sure that I've really unlocked the PCIe lock and also check for any obstructions, such as the chassis or other cables. Once the GPU is out, I marvel at its amazing engineering accomplishments for a while, and then put it away somewhere safe from any sources of static electricity. Using the original anti-static bag and box is a good option. Time to disconnect wires and connectors from the motherboard. Certain connectors, such as the front audio connector that I'm removing here, do not have a locking clip mechanism. I remove these by pulling them from the connector part and not the wire. It's also good to tuck away disconnected wires so they don't get caught accidentally in something. Here are some USB headers that I'm removing. These sure look flimsy, so I need to be careful. Sometimes another connector, such as this large USB 3.2 connector, might get in the way, so I disconnect these first if that's the case. Now, I disconnect the case power LED, power switch, and reset switch connectors. These connectors are quite flimsy and fragile, so I need to be careful. I then move on to removing the fan headers for my AIO board and the case fans from the motherboard. Sounds like I'm forgetting something. I will not be easily able to remove certain connectors, such as this 8-pin EPS CPU power connector due to the radiator being in the way, but I can always come back to it later after removing the radiator. Although I can leave the RAM DIMMs on the motherboard, in some instances they are getting in my way, so I just remove them. DDR4 DIMM slots have a release lever as shown on the left side that I need to push down to release the DIMM. If you're not sure how to do this, check your motherboard manual. Now I gently remove the DIMMs from the slots. Just don't pull too hard, as you may not have unlocked the DIMM, or maybe the DIMM is just caught in a corner, so just be careful. Now I remove the 24-pin ATX power connector. This one also has a clip that I need to sort of squeeze while plugging the connector out. Now onto removing the AIO pump from the CPU. I'm going to evenly release the pressure by going around the pump, undoing each screw a little at a time. As I continue undoing these screws, I will notice that the pump will begin to lift slightly. Now that I have sufficiently loosened the screws, I can remove them. I'm careful not to accidentally drop any back on the motherboard because these thumb screws can be quite heavy, so dropping them from a height onto your motherboard can potentially cause chips or cracks to the delicate components. Once done, I'm going to lift the pump away from the CPU. I will try to do this as level as possible, and I want to lift this carefully so I avoid getting thermal paste from the cold plate onto my hands or other components. Whoa, hold your horses there, cowboy. There's no thermal paste on this. What kind of a half-baked Mickey Mouse shop are you running here? Yeah, I can explain. I had to reshoot some footage due to camera setup issues, and I didn't put thermal paste back on the CPU because I had very little paste left at that point. Anywho, when I removed the pump the first time, I cleaned the thermal paste from the CPU and the pump. It was a bit of a mess actually, which means that I had originally applied a little too much paste on the CPU back a few months ago. I had to remove the CPU from the motherboard to clean it properly. 99% rubbing alcohol works nicely to remove paste from CPU, pump, or anything else. I will show how I remove a AMD CPU from its socket at the end of this video. Back to the task at hand, I now put the pump gently down and out of the way. It might be a good idea to double check for any leaks at this point, just to be safe. In order to access the radiator screws, I need to remove the top panel of my case since the radiator is top mounted. This top panel just snaps off. Feel free to skip this section if your case doesn't have a radiator. One thing is for sure though, a good air cooler will probably involve a lot less work. AIOs are not for the faint of heart. Here I have a 280mm radiator secured to the top of the case with 8 screws. The key is to remove these screws in such a way that I don't end up shifting the weight of the radiator suddenly to one side. So I start removing the screws from the left, the middle, and the right to kind of keep the load distribution even across. I will remove the 2 top center screws last, since due to their position, they will not cause the radiator to rotate while supporting it. With the radiator unscrewed from the case, now I can remove it. These things can be quite bulky, so I will need to work carefully around the case to safely remove it. I need to be careful not to sharply bend the pipes to avoid any potential leaks or spills. As you can see here, I'm clearly struggling to get this radiator out. Always remember the rule, don't use the force. At this point, I need to stop and try to figure out what is getting in the way. I secured the radiator back with a couple of screws so I can investigate the issue without having to hold the radiator in place by hand. Running into these sort of problems is not uncommon, especially if you haven't built your current PC, or like me, haven't touched certain parts for several years and totally forgotten how you put it together in the first place. Aha! By opening the right side panel, I can see that I have forgotten to remove the radiator fan wires, which are tied down to the chassis. Slightly embarrassing for sure, but that's okay, no one's perfect. Well, maybe except this guy. I detached the fan wires from the chassis. And here it is, coming out with minimum resistance. With the radiator removed, I can now disconnect the 8-pin EPS power connector that I couldn't reach earlier. Now that everything's disconnected, I can proceed to removing the motherboard. This is a ATX size motherboard, and it has 3 screws at the bottom, 3 screws on the top, and 3 screws in the middle. In my case, the center screw is sort of an alignment pin and not really a screw that can be removed. This pin is used to help with positioning the motherboard when installing it into the case. I try not to drop the screws into the case or motherboard. They can be a real pain trying to get back. It's best to use a magnetic screwdriver here. Notice here that I'm leaving the CPU and the 2 NVMe cards on the motherboard since they're not going to get in my way. With all the motherboard screws out, it's time to remove the motherboard. Here I left the motherboard slightly from the front and then gently pull it up, diagonally toward the front of the case and up. This helps with removing it from the case and also dislodging it from the IO shield connector at the back. Easy does it. Since I will install this motherboard in a new case, I will also need to remove the IO shield from the back by gently pushing it from the corners from the outside. Only the power supply remains in the case. However, I'm going to leave it here for my home office PC build. In order to remove the AMD CPU, I need to slightly push the release lever away from the socket and then lift it all the way up gently. This will change the alignment of the CPU socket to free the CPU. Once unlocked, I can gently pick up the CPU from its side. I try to avoid touching the pins with my fingers. To install the CPU back, I need to ensure the socket lever is lifted up to the unlocked position. I need to position the triangle indicator at the corner of the CPU with a similar indicator on the CPU socket. I gently release the CPU into the socket. It should go in with 0 insertion force. If it doesn't go in, then you're just doing it wrong. Once the CPU is in place, I lock the lever back in place to secure the CPU. If I want to remove the NVMe cards, I locate them on the motherboard first. Yours might be hidden behind a heatsink, so check your motherboard manual if you're not sure. NVMe cards are secured from one side by an M2 connector and by a screw on the other side. I simply remove the screw. I notice that the NVMe starts to lift from one end. And now gently pull the NVMe card away from the M2 socket. To insert the NVMe card back in, I need to match a notch on the NVMe card to a notch on the M2 connector and begin to gently push in. The other side of the NVMe card will remain raised. I want to gently push down the raised side back onto the motherboard. There should be no resistance. If I feel any resistance, I will stop and ensure I correctly insert the NVMe card. With the NVMe pushed down, I can screw it back into place. Keep in mind that NVMe cards must be installed on standoffs. If your motherboard doesn't have standoffs pre-installed, make sure you to install them first. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned a thing or two and have become a little bit more comfortable understanding what is involved in disassembling a PC. Please make sure you watch my next video where I will put this AMD PC back together with some new parts.